This is All Out Politics, news, debate and opinion from the heart of Westminster. G7 leaders met this weekend in Biarritz with a backdrop of blazing fires in the Amazon. They did agree to come up with a $20 million firefighting fund. But on the other burning issues, climate change, Iran, US, China and trade, there was little to suggest that much progress was made. There was no final communiqué. So does the G7 still work? Joining me to discuss that here in Westminster is Sir Jeremy Greenstock, former ambassador to the United Nations and a former special representative to Iraq. And from Tel Aviv, we're joined by Dr. Ariel Cohen, senior fellow at the Atlantic Council. Jeremy Greenstock, you're very experienced diplomat. Do G7s matter? Have they ever mattered? Do they still matter?
I think they do matter because it matters that the leaders get together and talk in their own way. We've got to remember, Adam, that the main institutions of post-Second World War life in the international arena are gradually fading in their effectiveness, and they're being replaced by a whole load of ad hoc diplomacy. And the G7 is one example of ad hoc diplomacy. They're not supposed to be a united group. They're supposed to be a group of industrialized economy leaders who want to sort out the problems between them and want to sort out the problems in the world that they agree on. And it's only ever partially effective. They don't agree on everything. And with the sort of leaders we're getting nowadays, there's less and less agreement on everything. But they do have a use and they do sort out some things while they're together.
What do you think, Dr. Cohen? Dr. Cohen, what do you think?
I think that our guest is right. They agree on less and less. But it doesn't mean that, for example, G7 should not agree on strategy towards Russia and China, which are the authoritarian countries that present the greatest political challenge to the West. After all, with the exception of Japan, the seven are all members of NATO. And secondly, they should take responsibility and agree on something that threatens all of us, including Russia and China, which is climate change. And that did not happen. There's a fundamental difference between Mr. Trump, who represents a more nationalist and populist streak in our politics, and the rest of the Europeans who formulate, with the exception of Boris Johnson, who formulate their policy as what's good to their nation states and what's good to Europe. And there was very little effort, in my view, to bridge those differences. And I don't think Mr. Trump is really ideologically understanding or is committed to the idea of the Euro-Atlantic community, to the idea of mutual defense. And at the same time, the Europeans could care less about US legitimate concerns with the Chinese economic threat to the American predominance. And the Europeans don't care about Iran, in my view. They would allow Iran to sort of coast through the current agreement that was negotiated under President Obama, and then move on to developing nuclear weapons only 10 years from now. And they can under this agreement.
OK, I mean, that's the problem to Jeremy Greenstock, isn't it? That, you know, on those key issues, whether it's climate change or China or Russia or Iran, there is now this clear transatlantic division, whereas before it used to be a partnership.
Yes, the sense of partnership is less with President Trump there because he says what he thinks and he thinks differently from his predecessors. But what's important to President Trump is American interests. And American interests lie, if you look at them objectively, at working with allies and trying to work out the problems that each face. There's no point in there being a transatlantic row, but President Trump wants to express things in his own way. Look at the way he has begun to come round to the need to talk to Iran if Iran is talkable to. Look at the way
that was cleverly posed, I thought, by President Macron, offering him another big summit one-on-one meeting.
I think President Macron has played this issue very cleverly, and I think he's a very able international diplomat. And he's offered Trump the opportunity to look at the idea of talking to Iran as he looks at the idea of talking to North Korea and to China and to Russia. Actually, the Trump philosophy is to talk to everybody if there's a deal in sight that's of interest to America. And other leaders can play with that, but they're unused to the lack of historic rhetoric about the great alliances and all the rest of it. This is very transactional. It doesn't mean to say it's valueless.
Dr. Cohen, let's take the issue of climate change, and obviously given particular focus by the Amazon fires. We've got a situation there where the other six all agree, want to come up with money, want to discuss this as a problem, and the United States doesn't even turn up for the main session. So, you know, in the end, isn't that more depressing, in spite of the progress made, that, you know, America's not going to play dealing with climate change?
Who is the question to?
I'm just saying,
Okay,
let's take an issue that, if you like, is non-big P political, climate change. And yet we've still got, when it comes to climate change and the Amazon, refusal of Donald Trump to participate.
Well, I would add that the United States has been bucking the Europeans on that since the Trump administration. He said he is not going to recognize the Paris agreements, Paris Accords that are volunteer. At the same time, the Europeans would not meet Trump halfway by increasing the imports of American liquefied natural gas instead of the Russian gas. And as much as the Europeans were criticizing Trump for inviting Vladimir Putin to the next G7, they would buy Putin's gas and not Trump's gas. So that is a paradoxical situation right there.
What about climate change? I mean, that is a sort of classic multilateral issue where if we don't work together, we can't solve it.
I think President Trump's approach is very disappointing on climate change. He's looking at it in a short-term way. He's looking at what appeals to his constituency in the United States. The Americans actually have reduced their carbon emissions by more than most other industrialized countries. The UK is in the lead on that in recent years. The UK comes next. The others whose rhetoric is very high, like Germany, haven't actually reduced their carbon by very much. So if you look at what Trump has done or allowed to happen, it isn't that bad. What he says is not very encouraging. You have to deal with a man who's looking for arrangements in his own terms, but actually shares in the end most of our interests. And I don't think he's going to be that bad on climate change. He's got a fellow president in Brazil whom he sympathizes with as a populist, as a right-winger, as somebody who speaks his mind, who's a bit Trumpian in outlook. He may have another one in the United Kingdom. He's looking for leaders like him to do bilateral business with. I think he will come in on this issue in a reasonably positive way in due course.
And would you bring Russia back into G7, put it back to G8 as John Major made it?
Yes, I would have Russia in the conversation, because the most important thing in our era to get right is to avoid conflict between the big powers. There's nothing that's going to wreck our lives more than all that breaking down. All sorts of regional stuff and other issues, the economy, climate change and everything, but conflict has to be avoided. Bring them into the conversation and hold them to account.
Would you bring them back, Dr. Cohen? Bring Russia back into the G7?
No, absolutely not yet. The Russians broke every rule in the rule book in Europe in 2014. They violated the borders that were not violated in Europe since 1945, and they were kicked out of the G8. They were not really belonging to the G8 because the G8 is a community of democratic countries, and Russia is not one. So yes, talk to Russians by all means, but only bring them back if there is a very concrete progress, such as relinquishing of Russian support of the separatists in eastern Ukraine and commitment to territorial integrity of Ukraine. Otherwise, you're giving Russia a prize for nothing. I would also like to add something about the climate change debate. The climate change real progress will not happen unless you have China and India and maybe other developing countries in the room. And the G7 need to develop a strategy together to engage China, India, and other developing countries and move much more quickly on reducing the emissions. And I understand these countries, the developing countries, want to industrialize. They want to go to the same trajectory as we did in the West. But we are at a point where the whole climate security of this planet is in danger, and we cannot just sit there and only think about the political constituencies. Jeremy Greenstock is right. Trump is thinking about it, but so does Angela Merkel and others. So we need to execute leadership. My op-ed in today's Newsweek is about the failure of leadership at this G7 summit. It was very obvious. And if, God forbid, we have the same weak leadership in World War II, we would be all speaking German today.
Okay, thank you all very much indeed.